If every tree in the Amazon rainforest were cut down tomorrow, within a decade the eastern half of South America would be a desert. The forest does not simply grow in a climate. It creates one. It generates its own rainfall. It recycles its own water. It builds its own soil. It regulates the temperature of an entire continent. Remove it, and the continent remakes itself into something that cannot support the agriculture, the cities, or the 2 billion people who depend on the water it produces. The Amazon is not a feature of South America. It is the mechanism by which South America functions. This is its story. The Amazon rainforest is the largest tropical rainforest on Earth, covering approximately 5.5 million square kilometers across 9 countries, with a vast majority lying within Brazil. It contains approximately 10% of all species on Earth, more than 40,000 plant species, over 1,300 bird species, 3,000 species of fish, 430 species of mammals, and an estimated 2.5 million species of insect, the majority of which have never been formally described or named by science. It produces approximately 20% of the world's oxygen through photosynthesis. Its river system discharges approximately 20% of all the fresh water that enters the world's ocean from rivers. It stores an estimated 150 to 200 billion tons of carbon in its vegetation and soil, more than 15 years of global industrial emissions at current rates. It has been continuously forested for at least 34 million years, through ice ages, mass extinctions, and every climatic shift the planet has produced in that time. And it is currently being destroyed at a rate that, if continued, would eliminate it within this century. To understand the Amazon, you have to start not with the trees but with the water, because the water is the reason for everything else. The Amazon River, the largest river on Earth by water volume, drains approximately 7 million square kilometers of South America, a catchment area roughly the size of Australia. It discharges approximately 209,000 cubic meters of water per second into the Atlantic Ocean, a flow so enormous that it dilutes the ocean salinity for over 200 kilometers offshore. But the volume of water moving through the Amazon River is only part of the story. An equal or greater volume of water moves through the forest itself, not along rivers but through the trees, absorbed by roots and released through leaves as water vapor in a process called transpiration that scales across the entire Amazon into something researchers have named flying rivers. The Amazon forest transpires approximately 20 billion tons of water per day into the atmosphere above it, creating vast rivers of water vapor that move westward through the sky at heights of a kilometer or more, carrying moisture from the Atlantic coast of Brazil all the way to the Andes and then northward into Central America and as far as the United States. The rainfall that falls on the soybean farms of Mato Grosso, on the cattle ranches of Terra, on the cities of Sao Paulo and Buenos Aires, is largely the product of moisture recycled by the Amazon forest and delivered to those locations by these atmospheric rivers. Remove the forest and the atmospheric rivers weaken or disappear. The rainfall decreases, and the agriculture that replaced the forest becomes unsustainable in the very places that were cleared to grow it. The soil of the Amazon holds one of the most important and least understood geological secrets in the Western Hemisphere. For most of the 20th century, soil scientists believed that the Amazon soils were inherently poor, a thin, nutrient-depleted layer atop deeply weathered bedrock that could support a forest only because of the extraordinary efficiency with which the forest recycled its own nutrients. This belief was partly correct and partly a dramatic underestimation of human presence. Scattered across millions of hectares of the Amazon basin, often adjacent to rivers and streams, are patches of extraordinarily dark, rich, fertile soil called Terra Preta, which means dark earth in Portuguese. Terra Preta is not naturally occurring. It was created by pre-Columbian Amazonian peoples over a period of centuries or millennia through the deliberate incorporation of charcoal, bone, manure, and organic waste into the soil in a practice of landscape management that transformed the infertile Amazon clay into some of the most productive agricultural soil in the world. Terra Preta patches, which occur in sites large enough to suggest dense and permanently settled human populations, can be several meters deep and can cover areas of many hectares. The charcoal incorporated into them is not ordinary charcoal but biochar, a form produced by slow burning in low oxygen conditions that resists decomposition for thousands of years, maintaining the soil fertility long after the civilizations that created it have disappeared. The existence of Terra Preta is evidence that the Amazon was not an untouched wilderness before European contact, but a landscape that had been inhabited, managed, and modified by millions of people for thousands of years, and that the Amazon we see today as extraordinary as it is, may be in some respects a depopulated shadow of a more densely settled and intensively managed landscape that existed before the catastrophic population collapse that followed European colonization. The diversity of the Amazon is so extraordinary that the numbers used to describe it lose their meaning quickly, and the only way to begin to grasp what they represent is to stand in it. 1 hectare of Amazon rainforest, a square approximately 100 meters on each side, typically contains between 200 and 400 species of tree, more species than exist in the entire natural flora of the British Isles. A single tree in that hectare may host more than 40 species of ant, more than any single country in Europe. A single square meter of leaf litter on the forest floor may contain more individual invertebrates than a football field of temperate grassland. The diversity exists at every scale, from the bacteria in the soil, of which a teaspoon of Amazon forest soil may contain more individual organisms than there are humans on Earth, to the forest giants, the Brazil nut trees and the Sonoma silk cotton trees, whose crowns emerge above the main canopy 40 to 50 meters above the ground. This diversity is not simply a biological fact. It is a product of a geological and evolutionary history of extraordinary complexity, involving the repeated fragmentation and reconnection of forest habitats by climate change, the uplift of the Andes creating new ecological gradients on an enormous scale, and the persistence of continuous forest cover through climatic fluctuations that eliminated biodiversity elsewhere. The Amazon is biologically rich partly because it is old, partly because it is large, and partly because the Andes gave it an altitudinal gradient from sea level to 6,000 meters within a few hundred kilometers, creating every conceivable tropical and subtropical environment in close proximity, each one filling with species that evolved to specialize in particular conditions. The relationship between the Amazon and the Andes is one of the most consequential in the history of South American life. When the Andes began their major uplift approximately 15 million years ago, they transformed the drainage of the entire continent. Before the Andes reached their current height, the Amazon basin drained westward into the Pacific, and the geography of the continent was entirely different from what it is today. As the Andes rose, they blocked this westward drainage and forced the rivers of the interior to reverse, eventually finding their way eastward to the Atlantic and forming the Amazon River system we know today. The uplift created an enormous shallow inland sea in the western Amazon basin that persisted for millions of years, and the sediments of this ancient sea, now covered by forest, form the vast floodplains of the western Amazon, where the river deposits some of the most fertile soil in South America. The Andes also created a barrier to atmospheric circulation that was responsible for much of the moisture that fed the Amazon forest, intercepting the trade winds and the moisture they carried from the Atlantic, and forcing that moisture to precipitate as rain on the eastern slopes of the mountains. The ecological zone created on the Andean slopes, from the lowland Amazon forest through cloud forest to the high-altitude grassland called the Paramo, compressed millions of years of habitat evolution into a vertical gradient that produced what is now recognized as the most biodiverse region on Earth, the tropical Andes, with approximately 4,000 to 5,000 plant species and over 3,500 vertebrate species, in an area that represents less than 1% of the Earth's land surface. The Amazon night is as different from the Amazon day as the Amazon is from any other place on Earth. At dusk, when the light filtering through the canopy finally fails and the forest enters a darkness that most of it never escapes even at midday, the acoustic landscape transformed completely. The birds that dominate the day fall silent, and the frogs, insects, and nocturnal mammals take over, building a chorus that in some parts of the forest is so dense and so loud that normal conversation at close range is difficult. The density and variety of sound in an Amazonian night is itself a measure of biodiversity, and acoustic ecologists have developed methods for assessing the health of forest ecosystems through the complexity of their soundscapes, finding that degraded or fragmented forests have measurably simpler acoustic environments than intact forests, and that the loss of certain frequency ranges from the soundscape can be used to detect the absence of specific groups of species before visual surveys have confirmed them. Beneath this acoustic environment, in the darkness of the forest floor, processes are happening that are invisible to anyone standing above them, and that are fundamental to the functioning of the entire forest. The mycorrhizal networks, the fungal threads connecting tree roots across the forest floor, are active continuously, moving carbon and nutrient between trees and exchanges that have been happening in this forest for millions of years. The leaf-cutter ants, whose colonies can number in the millions, are carrying their fragments of vegetation to underground fungal gardens and trails that can extend for hundreds of meters through the darkness. The army in bivouacs, temporary shelters made from the interlocked bodies of hundreds of thousands of worker ants, are pulsing with the movement of a superorganism that is, in its functional complexity, among the most sophisticated biological entities on the planet. The rivers of the Amazon basin are among the most biodiverse aquatic environments on Earth, and the fish community of the Amazon River system, with over 3,000 described species, is more diverse than the fish fauna of any other river system in the world, and represents approximately 10% of all fish species on Earth. The Amazon's fish have evolved in isolation for millions of years, developing forms and behaviors of extraordinary variety, from the electric eel, which generates discharges of up to 860 volts to stun prey, to the arapaima, one of the largest freshwater fish in the world, reaching lengths of up to 3 meters and weights of over 200 kilograms, to the tiny neon tetra, a fish so small it can be held in a teaspoon and so beautiful that it has become one of the most popular aquarium fish in the world. The river dolphins of the Amazon, the boto and the tucuxi, represent the evolutionary result of cetacean ancestors adapting to freshwater conditions in isolation, developing the long beaks and flexible necks required to navigate the complex root systems and submerged vegetation of the flooded forests. The boto, the pink river dolphin, holds a special place in Amazonian mythology and is considered by some indigenous communities to be a transformed human being, a belief that has historically provided it with a degree of cultural protection in the communities that hold it. The flooded forests of the Amazon, which remain inundated for months each year, represent a unique ecological zone in which the boundary between terrestrial and aquatic becomes completely irrelevant, and the fish community that exploits these forests has evolved to navigate, feed, and reproduce in conditions that no fish outside the Amazon experiences. The canopy of the Amazon is a world as distinct from the forest floor as a forest floor from the river, and for much of the history of Amazonian biology, it was completely inaccessible to researchers. The development of canopy walkways, climbing techniques, and most recently drone technology has opened the Amazon canopy to systematic investigation and produced findings that are transforming our understanding of tropical forest ecology. The canopy is where most of the photosynthesis happens, where most of the biodiversity is concentrated, and where most of the animals live. Yet it is a world in which most researchers have spent almost no time because of the difficulty of reaching it. What systematic canopy research has revealed is an environment of extraordinary complexity and specialization, in which different layers of the canopy support entirely different communities of species, with almost no overlap between the community living in the emergent layer above the main canopy and the community living in the shaded understory several meters below it. Individual trees in the Amazon canopy are often interconnected by a dense network of lianas, woody climbing plants that can reach lengths of hundreds of meters and that form highways through the canopy used by monkeys, sloths, and other arboreal animals to move between trees without descending to the dangerous forest floor. Epiphytes, plants that grow on other plants without drawing nutrients from them, cover every available surface in the middle and upper canopy, with a single large canopy tree sometimes supporting hundreds of individual epiphytes representing dozens of species, including orchids, bromeliads, ferns, and mosses, each one hosting its own community of insects, frogs, and microorganisms within its leaves or water-filled chambers. The indigenous peoples of the Amazon represent one of the most important and most endangered repositories of human knowledge on Earth, and their relationship with the forest is fundamentally different from any external research program or conservation initiative. There are approximately 400 indigenous groups living in the Amazon today, speaking approximately 240 different languages. Some of these groups have maintained continuous cultural traditions in the forest for thousands of years, developing through long experience and intimate knowledge of the forest plants, animals, soils, waterways, and seasonal cycles that is encoded in language, in ceremony, in practice, and in the management of the forest itself. The plant knowledge held by indigenous healers in the Amazon includes the identification and use of hundreds of species for medicinal, nutritional, and practical purposes, the majority of which have never been formally investigated by pharmacologists or biochemists. The relationships between plants identified in indigenous botanical knowledge and the pharmaceutical compounds they contain have been confirmed repeatedly in the limited cases where investigators have followed indigenous knowledge into formal chemical analysis, with examples including the discovery of curi as a muscle relaxant, quinine as an antimalarial, and numerous compounds now in clinical use derived from Amazonian plants that were identified first by indigenous healers. The knowledge held by indigenous Amazonian communities is not folklore, It is a product of thousands of years of empirical observation, experiment, and transmission, and it represents a scientific understanding of the forest that no external research program has yet come close to replicating. This knowledge is currently disappearing at the same rate as the languages that carry it, and the loss of each language is a loss of a unique understanding of the forest that exists nowhere else. The Amazon has been inhabited by humans for at least 15,000 years, and the scale of pre-Columbian occupation and landscape modification in the basin has only been understood clearly in the past 2 decades. Earlier estimates of Amazonian population at the time of European contact range from 1 million to 6 million people, numbers that seem consistent with the idea of a largely pristine forest sparsely inhabited by small, mobile groups. More recent research, incorporating LiDAR surveys that can detect archaeological features beneath the forest canopy from aircraft, large-scale excavation projects, and analysis of soils and vegetation patterns associated with settlement, has produced a dramatically different picture. LiDAR surveys of the Llanos de Mojos region of Bolivia have revealed the remains of an extraordinarily sophisticated hydraulic civilization that built hundreds of kilometers of raised fields, causeways, fish weirs, and forest islands across a vast area of seasonally flooded savanna, supporting a dense population that managed the landscape intensively for agricultural production. Similar landscape modification has been documented across large areas of the Amazon basin, suggesting that population estimates of 8 to 10 million people, and possibly substantially more, at the time of European contact are more consistent with the archaeological evidence than earlier, lower figures. The catastrophic population collapse that followed European contact, driven by introduced disease that killed as much as 90% of the indigenous population within a century, removed the management that maintained many of these landscape features. And the forest that grew back over the abandoned fields and settlements over the following centuries was interpreted by later European observers as pristine wilderness rather than regrowth on extensively modified ground. What Europeans call the untouched Amazon was in many areas a recovering landscape, a forest growing back over the ruins of civilization that had largely disappeared within a few generations of contact. The Amazon is burning, and the rate at which it is being destroyed has accelerated dramatically in the past decade in ways that have placed it at a tipping point recognized by scientists as one of the most critical in the history of the biome. Approximately 17% of the Amazon has been deforested since the 1970s, the majority converted to pasture for cattle ranching and to cropland for soybean production. In the Brazilian Amazon, deforestation rates peaked in the early 2000s at approximately 27,000 square kilometers per year, declined significantly following the implementation of the Action Plan for Prevention and Control of Deforestation in the legal Amazon in 2004, and then increased sharply again after 2018. When political changes in Brazil weakened the enforcement of environmental law and the monitoring of deforestation. In 2019, deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon reached its highest level since 2008, with over 10,000 square kilometers cleared in a single year. The fires that cleared this forest, many of them deliberately set to prepare deforested land for agricultural use, were visible from space and produced a smoke plume that darkened the skies over Sao Paulo during what should have been midday, prompting international media attention and a global outcry that briefly slowed the rate of destruction before the political pressures that drove it reasserted themselves. The economic forces driving Amazon deforestation are powerful, complex, and deeply embedded in global supply chains. The soy grown on deforested Amazonian land is exported around the world. Much of it is animal feed for poultry and pig production in Europe, China, and other major markets. The beef produced on Amazonian pasture is exported under Brazilian brand names that appear in supermarkets and fast food chains globally. The connection between consumption decisions made in London or Shanghai and the fire burning in Paris is real, measurable, and almost entirely invisible to the people making those decisions. The scientific concept of a tipping point, the threshold beyond which a system undergoes a self-sustaining transition to a fundamentally different state, has been applied to the Amazon with increasing urgency by the researchers who study it most closely. The Amazon forest system maintains itself through the flying rivers, the recycling of moisture from the Atlantic through the forest and back to the atmosphere in repeated cycles that sustain rainfall across the basin. As forest is removed, the moisture recycling capacity of the system decreases, and rainfall in the interior declines. Reduced rainfall causes more forest to die, releasing more carbon to the atmosphere, reducing further the moisture available for rainfall, and producing a positive feedback that drives the system toward a drier, more open vegetation type. Researchers Carlos Nobre and Thomas Lovejoy, two of the most respected Amazonian scientists of the past half-century, published a paper in 2018 arguing that the Amazon is approaching a tipping point at which the combination of deforestation and climate change will trigger a self-reinforcing transition of the eastern and southern Amazon from tropical rainforest to a savanna-like vegetation type, a transition that would be essentially irreversible on any human timescale. Their estimate of the threshold at which this transition becomes likely was a deforestation level of between 20 and 25% of the original forest area, a figure that the Brazilian Amazon was approaching at the time of publication. The transition, if it occurs, would not simply affect the Amazon. It would affect the rainfall of South America, the global carbon cycle, and the biodiversity of a region that contains a tenth of all life on Earth. The Amazon is also one of the places where the future of medicine may be determined, and the case for its conservation on purely pharmaceutical grounds is one that the scientific community has not yet made loudly enough. Of the approximately 40,000 plant species in the Amazon, fewer than 1% have been screened for bioactive compounds. The compounds that have been investigated have produced an extraordinary yield of medically relevant molecules, from mercury alkaloids that revolutionized anesthesia, to the ACE inhibitors derived from the venom of the lancehead pit viper that transformed the treatment of hypertension, to the compounds from Amazonian tree frogs that are being investigated as non-addictive painkillers. The frog alone, a group represented by over 1,000 species in the Amazon, produces skin secretions of extraordinary chemical complexity that serve as chemical defenses against predators and pathogens, and that include compounds active against bacteria, fungi, viruses, and cancer cells. The poison dart frogs, whose brilliant colors advertise the toxicity of their skin secretions to potential predators, sequester alkaloids from the ants and beetles that eat and modify them into compounds of remarkable pharmacological potency. Epibetadine, a compound isolated from an Ecuadorian poison dart frog in the 1980s, proved to be approximately 200 times more potent as a painkiller than morphine and generated enormous research interest in non-opioid analgesics before its toxicity at therapeutic doses proved to be a practical obstacle. The derivatives being investigated from its structure remain among the most promising leads in non-addictive pain management research. The frog that produced them went extinct in the wild due to habitat destruction before the research it had initiated was complete. The Amazon has a future, and the shape of that future will be determined by decisions being made right now by governments, by corporations, by consumers, and by the 1 million indigenous people who currently live within it and who have, historically, been its most effective guardians. The evidence that indigenous land management is the most cost-effective and most durable form of Amazon conservation is now substantial and has been documented in peer-reviewed research across multiple countries and multiple political contexts. Deforestation rates on legally recognized indigenous territories in the Brazilian Amazon are dramatically lower than on unprotected land, even after controlling for remoteness and accessibility. The legal recognition of indigenous territorial rights is not simply a matter of justice, though it is that. It is the single most effective instrument available for the protection of the forest, and the evidence supporting this conclusion is as clear as any in the field of conservation science. The Amazon nations, the indigenous political organizations formed by Amazonian peoples to advocate for their rights and their territories, have been among the most effective voices in the international negotiations on climate and biodiversity that will determine the legal and financial framework within which Amazon conservation either succeeds or fails. They have also been among the most targeted by the violence that accompanies deforestation, with Amazonian land defenders killed at a rate that has been documented by Global Witness and other organizations as among the highest of any category of human rights defender anywhere in the world. The people most committed to the preservation of the forest, who have the most knowledge of it and the longest relationship with it, are also the most likely to be killed for defending it. The Amazon is 5.5 million square kilometers of living complexity, the product of 34 million years of uninterrupted evolution, the home of a tenth of all species on Earth, the water supply for 2 billion people, the carbon store of a planet, and the clearest demonstration available of what the natural world can do at its full extent and at its full depth, when it is left to operate without interruption for millions of years. It is also, right now, being destroyed faster than it can be documented, in a process driven by global economic forces that the people living inside it did not create and cannot stop alone. The question of the Amazon's future is not a question about nature. It is a question about what kind of world we are willing to allow and what we are willing to do to prevent the kind we do not want. The forest is large enough to survive for a long time under pressure, but not indefinitely, not under the pressure being applied to it now. And when it passes a threshold that the scientists have identified, it will not announce the moment. It will simply, over decades, become something else. The flying rivers will weaken. The rains will come less reliably. The soil will dry. The savanna grasses will advance into the spaces where the trees fell and did not grow back. And somewhere in that transition, 10% of all life on Earth will begin the long process of going quietly out of existence, not in a single catastrophic moment, but in the slow, accumulating silence of a world that was too large and too important and too ancient to seem like it could dissipate. It can, it is, and the time to stop it is now. While it is still possible to stop it, while the threshold has not yet been crossed, while the flying rivers are still flowing and the trees are still standing and the forest is still, in its extraordinary patient way, alive. The Amazon is not simply a forest. It is a laboratory, and the science being done inside it is among the most consequential in the world. The Biological Dynamics of Forest Fragments project, established in the 1970s by Thomas Lovejoy, and now the longest-running tropical forest experiment in the world, was designed to test a specific and practically important question. How small can a piece of forest become before it starts losing species? The answer, derived from 4 decades of continuous monitoring of forest fragments of different sizes ranging from 1 hectare to 10,000 hectares surrounded by cattle pasture in the Brazilian Amazon, has shaped the theory and practice of conservation biology globally. Small fragments, even those only slightly isolated from the main forest, lose species rapidly. Beginning with the species most vulnerable to the changed conditions of the fragment edge, the zone of transition between the forest interior and the surrounding pasture where temperature is higher, humidity is lower, wind penetrates further, and the lighting conditions are different from the forest interior. Large, shy mammals, specialist birds, certain tree species requiring the interior microclimate of intact forests, and many insect and amphibians disappear from small fragments within years of isolation. The experiment demonstrated that a forest fragment is not simply a small forest. It is a degraded environment in which the edge effects penetrate deeper than the fragment itself, and in which the species community is in a state of continuous loss rather than stable equilibrium. A hectare of Amazon forest standing alone in a sea of pasture is not equivalent to a hectare continuous Amazon forest. It is a piece of habitat in the process of biological collapse, losing species faster than they can be replaced, until what remains is a simplified community of edge-tolerant generalists with none of the extraordinary diversity that defined the original forest. The medicinal plants of the Amazon are used daily by millions of people across South America in forms ranging from the traditional preparation of plant materials by indigenous healers to the formulation of pharmaceutical products by companies whose supply chains reach into the forest. Copaiba oil, extracted from the resin of copaiba trees by tapping the trunk in the same way that rubber is tapped, has been used by indigenous Amazonian peoples as an anti-inflammatory and wound healing agent for centuries and has been the subject of increasing pharmacological interest as its active compounds, particularly a ditapene called copalic acid, have shown activity in laboratory studies against inflammatory pathways relevant to cancer, bacterial infection, and pain. Andiroba oil, extracted from the seeds of the andiroba tree that grows throughout the Amazon basin, has documented activity as an insect repellent, anti-inflammatory, and wound healing agent and is already used in commercial cosmetic and pharmaceutical formulations in Brazil. Cat's claw, a woody vine whose bark has been used in traditional Andean and Amazonian medicine for centuries to treat inflammation, infection, and cancer, contains alkaloids and polyphenols that have shown biological activity in laboratory and clinical studies, and that have attracted pharmaceutical development interest. These are not outliers or curiosities. They are examples drawn from a set of hundreds of Amazonian plants with documented traditional medicinal use and pharmacological activity, most of which have been examined only at the level of preliminary biological screening. The Amazon is a pharmacopoeia of extraordinary scale and depth, and the rate at which its plants are being lost to deforestation before they are investigated is a medical as well as an ecological catastrophe. The Amazon's insects alone represent one of the most underexplored frontiers in all of biology. Of the estimated 2.5 million insect species in the Amazon, only a fraction have been formally described, and the rate at which new species are being discovered continues to outpace the rate at which the taxonomy and biology of known species is being worked out. The butterflies of the Amazon, with approximately 3,000 species, have been relatively well studied compared to most other insect groups, and the patterns of their diversity and distribution have been used to infer broader patterns of biodiversity across the basin. The ants, with approximately 1,000 described species in the Amazon, but an estimated several times that number undescribed, represent a biomass that rivals that of all the vertebrates in the forest combined, and their roles in seed dispersal, decomposition, soil turnover, and predation make them functionally critical to forest processes at every scale. The termites, similarly abundant but even less studied, are responsible for the majority of woody material decomposition in the Amazon, their gut microbiomes housing communities of bacteria and protozoa that perform the chemical breakdown of cellulose and lignin that few other organisms can achieve. The beetles, which as a naturalist J.B.S. Haldane famously quipped appear to represent God's inordinate fondness for a single group, are represented in the Amazon by tens of thousands of species performing every conceivable ecological role from pollination to decomposition to predation to parasitism. The scientific inventory of Amazon insect diversity is, by any honest estimate, less than 10% complete, and the species being lost to deforestation are disappearing before they have been found. The Amazon has experienced profound change before, and understanding those past changes is essential to understanding what makes the current crisis different. During the last glacial maximum, approximately 20,000 years ago, when global temperatures were approximately 5 to 6 degrees Celsius lower than today and the global climate was dominated by the massive ice sheets covering North America and Europe, the Amazon was cooler and drier than it is now. The extent of the forest during this period has been debated for decades, with some researchers arguing that the forest contracted dramatically into isolated refugia, separate patches of forest surrounded by savanna or dry forest, and others arguing that the forest remained more continuous than the glacial climate suggested. The genetic evidence from the extraordinary diversity of Amazonian species, with many closely related species showing distributions consistent with a history of isolation in different parts of the basin, supports at least some fragmentation during glacial periods. And the refugia hypothesis has been used to explain the extraordinarily high species richness of certain Amazonian regions as a product of millions of years of repeated isolation and reconnection, with each cycle of fragmentation driving speciation in the isolated populations. What is clear from the geological record is that the Amazon has survived dramatic climatic changes in the past and has repeatedly recovered and expanded from periods of contraction. What makes the current crisis categorically different from these past changes is not the magnitude of the climate shift, which is in some measures comparable to or smaller than the change of the glacial maximum, but the combination of direct physical destruction through deforestation with climate change operating simultaneously and in ways that reinforce each other at a rate of change that is orders of magnitude faster than anything the forest has previously experienced. Evolution cannot keep pace with change measured in decades. The forest cannot migrate northward or upward faster than chainsaws are removing it southward and downward. The refugia of the next century will not be patches of forest surrounded by savanna. They will be patches of forest surrounded by cities and farms and roads, and the distance between them will be too great for most species to cross. The Amazon River system itself is one of the world's great geological and biological wonders, and its seasonal behavior determines the rhythm of life for every organism and every community in the basin. The annual flood, driven by the wet season rains falling across an enormous catchment, raises the river level by 10 to 15 meters in the western Amazon and inundates millions of square kilometers of forest and floodplain for 4 to 7 months of the year. During this flood, the river transforms entirely in character. The channel boundaries disappear as the water rises into the forest, connecting what in the dry season are separate water bodies into a vast, shallow inland sea in which every tree on the floodplain is submerged to a depth that varies from a few centimeters of the forest margin to several meters closer to the main channel. Fish move freely through this flooded forest, feeding on the fruits, seeds, and insects that fall from the trees above them, performing critical roles in seed dispersal that the forest itself depends on. The tambaki, a large fruit-eating fish that in the dry season feeds on invertebrates in the river, switches during the flood to a diet composed almost entirely of the seeds of rubber trees, palm nuts, and other large-seeded forest trees, swallowing the seeds whole and depositing them in its feces kilometers from the parent trees when it later defecates in open water. The ecological relationship between the tambaki and the trees whose seeds it disperses is as precisely co-evolved as any flower and its pollinator, and the loss of the tambaki from river systems where it has been overfished has measurable consequences for the regeneration of the floodplain forest. The river feeds a forest, and the forest feeds a river, in a cycle of exchange so intimate that the distinction between aquatic and terrestrial ecology in the Amazon floodplain is largely a matter of the season in which you are looking. The Amazon's future has been the subject of intense modeling and projection by climate and ecology researchers, and the range of possible futures are described span from cautiously optimistic to catastrophic, depending on the trajectory of deforestation, fire, and climate change over the next few decades. The most optimistic scenario involves a rapid halt to deforestation, large-scale restoration of degraded lands, and successful international action on climate change that limits global temperature rise to manageable levels. In this scenario, the Amazon recovers significant forest cover over the coming decades, the flying rivers stabilize, and the biome avoids a tipping point while retaining the bulk of its biodiversity and carbon storage function. The most pessimistic scenario involves continued deforestation at current or accelerating rates, severe climate change, and a crossing of the tipping point by the middle of this century, leading to a transition that converts the eastern and southern Amazon to a degraded savanna state from which recovery within any human timescale is effectively impossible. Between these extremes lies a range of partial outcomes involving some areas crossing the threshold while others remain intact. Biodiversity loss is concentrated in the most disturbed regions, while the most remote and the best protected areas retain much of their richness, and the forest permanently diminished from its current state, but still the largest tropical rainforest on Earth by a significant margin. Which of these futures occurs is not determined by any natural process. It is determined by political will, economic incentives, law enforcement, international cooperation, and the choices made by billions of people about what they buy, what they eat, and what they demand from the governments and corporations that act in their name. The Amazon is not being lost to climate. It is being lost to choices, and choices can be changed.